Welcome to Private Capital Insiders, the podcast where we explore how private equity and other private capital investors actually create value in a market defined by disruption and change. Today's episode is titled The Future Ready Board: What Traditional Board Selection Gets Wrong. My guest today is Jay Weiser, a governance and leadership advisor who works with boards and C-level teams on future-ready strategy, decision-making, and enterprise resilience. In this conversation, we're going to dig into why legacy board selection models are falling behind and what boards should be looking for instead. Adaptability, resilience under pressure, learning agility, and the ability to navigate disruption alongside management. So let's get started. Welcome to the Private Capital Insider Podcast, Jay.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really enjoyed your participation in our last conference in New York. It was, you added some great value. So give us a quick snapshot of your background for the audience before we jump in, if you would.
Sure. Well, again, Jay Weiser, and I'm the Chief Catalyst and Navigator of Jay Weiser Consulting. And what I focus on is helping boards become future ready. And what that means is boards today are having to confront things they've never had before. And the question is, do they have the capabilities to do that? And it's about anticipation and adapting. And future readiness is what you need so you can thrive in today's environment, not just kind of hang on by your fingernails.
Right. So board recruitment is historically prioritized former CEOs, CFOs, and industry veterans. Why do you believe that that model is becoming less effective today, is the way I understand it?
Well, I think simply put, past performance is not predictive of future performance. The fact that you've been a CEO or a CFO, what made you successful up until today is not necessarily what you'll need going forward. You're now operating under pressure. You're operating under a completely different environment. You're having to make decisions differently. And it's how do you do that under pressure, not just yourself as a board member, but as part of the board collectively to make sure signals get discussed in a timely manner. There's a right level of debate. There's a level of engagement that helps you create value for the organization versus just rubber stamping.
Makes sense to me, Jay. So I'm wondering, many organizations rely heavily on psychometric assessments, traditional evaluation tools. We've all heard of many, and there are some good ones out there as well. Where do you think those frameworks fall short, if they do?
So I think the first thing, they're good tools, but the question is, what are they measuring? They're looking at behavior, they're looking at trait, what's your cognitive style, but what they're not looking at is decision making under ambiguity. They're not looking at behavior under stress. They're not looking at how you interact in the boardroom. These are different capabilities. So it's not just what you know, it's what you can do in real time in these high pressure situations.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me as well. So you often distinguish, as I've heard you talk, between competencies and these capabilities. So what are the capabilities boards should actually be evaluating today?
So I've actually developed a leadership capability model that looks at the 5 tensions that boards and leaders today need to manage. And instead of either or thinking, I can do this or I can do that, these are tensions where a leader, a board member, a board chair needs to do both. So I'm going to quickly tell you what the 5 are, and then I'll give you a little more detail on 2. So the first one is being a present futurist. Second is being an experienced learner. Third is being a prepared risk taker. Fourth is being a strategic executor. And fifth is being an accountable collaborator. Let me tell you a little more about present futurist. So present futurist is somebody who robustly understands the present. They're talking to different stakeholders. They understand the macro environment. At the same time, they're monitoring trends. They're paying attention to early warning signals. They're thinking through different scenarios and they're integrating that information together to inform decisions. That's a lot better than being a board member who, only focuses on the past, is only looking backwards, and spends very little time on the future. It's not either or. You need to do both.
Yeah. It sounds like that's the definition of what future readiness would mean in a board context, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about one more, just real quick.
Sure.
Uh, is being a prepared risk taker. Now, it's interesting because boards very often say, oh, whoa, wait a minute, we're not here to take risk. Well, risk is a part of every decision in business, and it comes into play even when you don't make a decision. So it's about smart risk taking, it's about learning and adapting. So risk taking is important. That's how you grow, that's how you innovate. Now, at the same time, you want to be better prepared. And better prepared means that, you're reading the board deck. You're talking to not only the CEO, but the other members of the leadership team. It means you're taking some basic steps, kind of like if you live on the East Coast, they get hurricanes, you have duct tape, you have batteries, you maybe have water, some basic things. Same thing for a company. What do you do in a crisis? Do you have a playbook? Uh, do you know how you going to communicate? Do you know the right people to pull in depending on the situation? So that way, by being a prepared risk taker, you're going to be more resilient, more adaptable.
So, can you draw from one of your experiences and perhaps assisting a firm select a board individual or the evaluation of a board candidate? Is there something you can share? Obviously, redact the names. But can you give us an example of a situation that perhaps started out, in one direction and wound up in a different direction, or there was a different conclusion when the selection process was complete?
So, again, I think folks very often focus on being a CFO, somebody who knows the numbers, or a CEO. So there was a candidate, and I was advising the CEO and the board chair at the time.
Mhm.
And this person had impeccable credentials. They had worked for blue chip firms. They had extensive experience as a CFO and in operations. And they really liked the person. There was a good cultural fit. But what we didn't have a sense of, at least in the first and second round of interviews, is how does that person handle change? How do they handle making decisions under pressure? How
Mhm.
well do they work with the other CXOs, HR, finance, HR, marketing, IT? Uh, because if you're only numbers, you're looking at results and you're not looking at what the drivers of performance are. So we made a point of asking these questions explicitly. Now, as that came out, the person, we could see that they're adaptable in how they were thinking. They were thinking on their feet. They were bringing up past examples of how they worked across different functions, which is something that we were looking for on the board. So somebody who has more of a T profile, somebody who can talk to these different issues and it's, not just narrowly focused on finance. But we wouldn't have known that unless we asked those specific questions. And it's questions like that I think are incumbent for boards to ask, because you don't want to bring in a one trick pony. You want to bring somebody in who has capabilities, across functions, across different domains, so they can look at things more holistically.
Yeah. So we call that pressure testing, right? How would you describe what pressure testing looks like from your point of view? Because real leadership is going to get tested under pressure, as you mentioned before. So how should organizations think about evaluating leaders for that uncertainty, that disruption, and that potential crises?
So I think first of all, is asking them to recall when they've had these crises before. How have you dealt with situations you've never dealt with before? Um, how do you think about tariffs? How do you think they would affect our business? So if let's just say that CFO is interviewing for a board position, I happen to be a company where we manufacture products. So asking about tariffs and talking through what the impact of the business is, so you get a sense of how they would actually think when they're on the board. What questions would they be asking? You could look at the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. Where does energy come in? And it's not just these single issues. It's when different issues combine, you're now dealing with a much more complex situation. So,
Mm-hmm.
so taking people through those scenarios, and it's the same thing for existing directors. Is making sure they're up to snuff, not just to govern today, but to govern in the future as well.
Do you get involved with the selection process, issues around industry experience, vertical experience, that type of thing? How important is that?
So I think a board, you really want to have a mix. The fact that somebody has 20 years in a particular industry or 10 years in your industry, might mean they have great depth, which is good. On the other hand, it might mean they're very tied to legacy thinking. So I think it's good to have that diversity of thinking, diversity of backgrounds. Think about industries that are tangential to yours, or, um, for example, early in my career, I was involved in banking. Well, banks used to think rather monolithically, but then banks started hiring people who had retail backgrounds and started thinking about their branches as stores. That was a complete change in mindset and how banks were managed. So that's an example in terms of going outside your industry, because every one of our businesses is changing. Business models are changing. So it's helpful to get those outside perspectives.
Right, makes sense. So the final question I have for you, because our time comes close to an end here, is the future. And how do you see the role of the board evolving over the next few years, given we've got AI to consider now, becomes more embedded in governance and decision making, right?
No, absolutely. There are a number of challenges coming up. Uh, you know, one is AI. How does AI integrate into the business? How does it change the experience of board members and employees? Um, AI can help with certain things. It's good at synthesizing board materials, identifying patterns and anomalies, but it's the more critical part is not just synthesizing the information, but how board members are able to interpret that situation. And it's about interpretation sometimes when you don't have all the information. Uh, in a complex world, there's not a single answer, and we're never going to have all the information, so you have to make decisions. And very often I talk about one-way door decisions and two-way door decisions. Two-way door decision, you can make a decision, you can undo it if it doesn't work. That's okay, and you're learning and you're adjusting.
Mm.
One-way decisions, you need to take a little more time, because once you made the decision, you've committed a certain amount, and then you have to think about, okay, do we know enough? Are we comfortable taking that risk? Doesn't mean we shouldn't, but it requires more diligence. So it's understanding, one, how do you make decisions in imperfect information? It's about understanding the drivers of your business. It's understanding that change can come quickly. And I always say you can't be future proof, but you can be future ready. And it's about preparing for the future. So it's having that readiness to adapt.
That's great, Jay. I wish we had more time to dive into this in greater depth. Perhaps we'll pick this up on another episode, but that's all the time we have for now. So, Jay, what's the best way to reach you if someone wants to reach out?
So two ways. First of all, you can reach me via email, Jay at Weiser, JayWeiser.com. And I also encourage listeners to follow me on LinkedIn. I share, a fair amount of content, and it's an opportunity for you to become part of the discussion that I'm having with other board members as well.
You're always very generous with your knowledge and wisdom, Jay. We thank you for being on the podcast here. Um, Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Private Capital Insiders. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe. You can also follow Private Capital Global for more updates and exclusive content. We host events for the private investment community throughout the country and even in the UK. So check out our events page and join our Private Capital Connect community, participate in the discussion. And remember, smart private capital moves start with insightful conversations. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Private Capital Insiders.